debate. The honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and make my own contribution to the debate on Bill C-47 tonight. Elsewhere, I've spoken more at length about some of the things I think are commendable in the budget, including another doubling of the GST rebate, which is an important way to help Canadians that are struggling the most with the cost of inflation without returning more money to the pockets of Canadians for whom extra spending might be inflationary. And a lot of private sector economists have recognized the virtue of this approach that the NDP pioneered and have managed to extend in the budget here. I've talked about the importance of dental care and the good that it will do for millions of Canadians to be able to finally access dental care when they haven't had that privilege before. Something that should not be a privilege, but should be a right for every Canadian wherever they are in the country. I've talked also about an important step, not a step that meets the need in any way for Indigenous people that are struggling like other Canadians with the housing crisis, but in an even more acute way with more challenges for how to deliver housing properly. Over $4 billion in the last 12 months to an Indigenous-led strategy where Indigenous people themselves will be making decisions about how better to house their people in urban, rural, and northern areas. And some important labor conditions on federal funding for the new energy economy, ensuring that public dollars that are invested in that new energy economy don't just go to large corporations and they get siphoned out of the country, but actually go to Canadian workers by requiring those companies to pay prevailing wages, not just the hourly wage, but the wage package, which includes benefits and pension amounts to their workers in order to qualify for that federal funding, and to have 2 seats for Labour on the board of the Growth Fund that the Liberal government is establishing to ensure that workers and their interests are represented in the investment decisions of that fund. And those are just some of the things that the NDP has pushed for to see in the budget that we think are going to make a difference, a positive difference, in the lives of Canadians. I've also talked about many of the things that are not in the budget that ought to have been, including urgent reform to the employment insurance system, which the Liberal government has promised now for close to 8 years and hasn't done. In the meantime, they actually revolutionized the EI system, completely changed it, and then they've come back full circle to the EI system that the Harper government left in 2015. So we've made no progress, despite years of promises and a demonstration that they can do it. They did do it. They had a minimum benefit. They had one universal qualifying threshold with low hours. They had a higher income replacement rate for many people on the program. Like a lot of the things that EI needs in order to be a successful program that's there for Canadians when they most need it, which incidentally is in a period of recession, which the budget says is coming. So when will the employment insurance reform come? They know where the account is because they took $25 billion of CERB debt that doesn't belong there and plunked it right in there, ensuring that premiums for workers and employers will go up consistently for the next 7 years, trying to pay down a $25 billion debt that doesn't belong there in the first place. So it's certainly not because they don't know about EI or they don't know where to find the account. Up to now, over $60 billion has been taken out of the EI operating account by successive Liberal and Conservative governments. Well, as far as I'm concerned, adding $25 billion of debt that belongs there is another expenditure that doesn't belong on the EI account, and we're now in the territory of about $85 billion that Liberal and Conservative governments have taken from EI ratepayers that they never had any right to in the first place, and the EI account would be in very good shape, thank you very much, and perfectly capable of sustaining the kind of reforms that we need to have for the sake of Canadian workers if that money hadn't been taken out of there in the first place. That's a perfect example of what's not in this budget that ought to be, and Canadians can count on New Democrats to continue to press this government to get the job done. Just as they should get the job done on housing. I talked a little bit about a modest win when it comes to Indigenous housing in terms of allocating some funding in the budget. Nowhere near enough, and that's just for the needs in Indigenous communities, never mind the amount of non-market housing we need to build in order to meet the needs of people right across the country from coast to coast to coast. But it's not just about spending money. It's also about taking regulatory action in order to constrain the investment activity that's happening from private actors with deep pockets all over the country that is driving up the cost of housing, whether it's driving up the cost of rental housing for Canadians who need affordable rental housing, or whether it's driving up the cost of a home that Canadians would aspire to own. In either case, it's a problem. And we need to see a government that's willing to take action. And I've talked elsewhere about the kinds of things New Democrats believe can be done by the government that wouldn't cost a dime to taxpayers in order to relieve some of that investment pressure that's driving up houses in the real estate market. Now, there's been a fair bit of debate tonight about the budget, rightly so. We've heard a lot about the carbon tax and inflation. And, you know, these are important debates, and I respect how people are being affected by inflation, certainly. I see it in my own community. We are not in any way immune to the rise in the use of food banks, people having to make tough choices. But I do want to talk a little bit about the nature of inflation, because when you listen to Liberals and Conservatives debate inflation, what never comes up, again, this is what they share in common with housing. They don't want to talk about the role that deep-pocketed investors are playing driving up the cost of housing for Canadians. And when we talk about inflation more generally, they don't want to talk about the role that corporate Canada has been playing in jacking up prices for Canadians. There's been reports out, more than one, that say up to 25% of the inflation that Canadians have experienced are related exactly and precisely to excessive profits by corporations. What do we mean by excessive profits? We mean profits over the pre-pandemic baseline. So an increase in the rate of profit for these companies. The oil and gas sector is a good example. They've seen outsized increases in their profits. Over the last couple of years, they've seen 1,000% increase in their profits. That's a lot of money. What do we mean when we say excess profits? We mean expanding your profits by 1,000% over 2 years, because who pays for that? Conservatives are quick to talk about how every penny that's raised in taxes comes out of Canadian pockets. Well, guess what? Every penny that's raised at the pump comes out of Canadians' pockets too. And I'm not just talking about the pennies that go to government and the carbon tax or the gas tax or whatever else. I'm talking about the pennies that go to provide that 1,000% increase over 2 years in corporate profits for oil and gas. That's why New Democrats have been advocating for an excess profits tax. We forced the Liberals to do it when it comes to banks and insurance companies. And we've also said that that should apply to oil and gas companies. Well, what do we hear from the Conservatives when we talk about that? They say, oh, well, they'll just charge it to the consumer. You know, they'll just pass that on to the consumer. There's probably some truth in that. That's why the member for Windsor West has done an excellent job talking about how we should have a formal body that regulates price increases so that Canadians can be sure that they're getting a fair shake at the pump, something we've done for decades in Manitoba with the Public Utilities Board in respect of auto insurance rates and Manitoba hydro rates and gas prices for heating your home. So this isn't like something out of left field. This is something that provinces do in respect of important price controls, something that the member for Windsor West has done a lot of great work on. But the other thing that they neglect to mention is that if you remove the carbon tax, for some reason they think if there's additional tax, they'll just pass that on to the consumer. But if by lowering a tax we create more disposable income, they somehow think that oil and gas companies aren't going to raise their prices to gobble that up too. Well, we got a problem. Yeah, the oil and gas companies win, it seems, no matter what you do. That's why the member for Windsor West is bang on and talking about a real way to control oil and gas prices. But they best believe that reducing those kinds of taxes in a period where the oil and gas companies have been jacking up their prices and making 1,000% increases in their profits over 2 years, they're going to gobble that up too. And that's why targeted tax relief, like doubling the GST rebate, has been praised by private sector economists as a good way to provide relief to Canadians who need it the most without contributing to inflation. And broad-based tax relief, as the kind that the Conservatives advocate for, is seen as something that would contribute to inflation. Never mind the fact that BC, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Northwest Territories all have their own carbon pricing system imposed provincially. So getting rid of the carbon tax isn't going to make a whit of difference for people who live in those provinces. So we have a broad-based tax measure proposed that economists say will be inflationary and only provides relief to people in about half the country. That's not a plan. That's just a talking point.
A member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I certainly appreciate the member's contribution to tonight, although I have to disagree with some of the flaky theories that he has. For example, it's provincial jurisdiction that allows for price controls or for information systems to basically force gas companies to post ahead of time what their prices are and what their inputs are. That's something that provinces can do right now. But my home province of British Columbia, the NDP government has chosen not to. In fact, they've backed away from all the big talk about excess profits and people being gouged. What I would like to say to this member is that he continues to talk about, that if we just had another tax, we would make all this money go to people. Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, what will happen here is that it used to be where government would say to the big oil and gas companies, hire lots of people, expand your projects, invest it back into it. They can't because of NDP and Liberal policies that have made it impossible for them to do so. What does that member have to say about that?
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
I would say if times were so tough for oil and gas companies, they wouldn't have seen a 1,000% increase in their profit over 2 years. I think the member should look at the numbers and give his head a shake.
Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And nothing flaky about standing up for people who need affordable housing support. And so I want to ask the member, and I really respect his interventions every time he gets up and speaks in the House. I want to ask the member about the comments he made about real estate investment trusts and the issue that we're dealing with as it relates to the commodification of housing and the impact that it's having on people in terms of the rising rents, rent evictions, and other things. And so I really respected the fact that he got up and he's talked about that a number of times, and I'd like for him to expand upon that in terms of what that means to renters and what the government needs to do in terms of providing assistance regarding the same.
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. One of the things that government could be doing is working to establish a nonprofit acquisition fund. So there are a lot of nonprofits with great experience running housing complexes that know how to get the job done, but find out too late that a building with affordable units might have been available or on the market. Corporate landlords, better connected with deeper pockets, find out sooner, and by the time there's more public knowledge of that building coming up on the market, in fact, it's already been scooped. And so providing a way for like a notice period for that kind of sale and making funds available for competent nonprofits to be able to swoop in and compete with some of these big corporate landlords is a really important piece of the puzzle. I think having, looking at the idea as they've done in New Zealand of having escalating down payments as you own more properties, that you're required to put up more, instead of just leveraging equity out of your existing properties for the same amount of down payment, is another way to try to have a bit of control over really excessive investment activity in the residential housing space. These are just some of the ideas out there about what government could do. The Nonprofit Acquisition Fund obviously does involve some government investment, but different rules around escalating down payments do not. So that's an example of something the government could be doing right now that doesn't cost money and could help have a cooling effect in the residential housing market.
Remember London Fanshawe.
And it's always a pleasure to listen to the honourable member from Elmwood Transcona. I wanted to ask him actually about that grocery rebate, and why do you think instead of calling it the doubling of the GST, the government decided to call it that? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you. That was it's kind of a curiosity, isn't it? Because I think a doubling of the GST rebate is very clear and it's very honest in terms of what it is. I think the grocery rebate branding has caused some confusion, and we had finance department officials at committee just recently. I had the opportunity to ask them about that, in fact, and they confirmed that from a technical perspective, there's no difference at all. So it is just another doubling of the GST rebate, as we've been happy to talk about on this side of the House. I asked if the tax officials in the department moonlighted as branding specialists and maybe recommended up to the minister's office that it be called a grocery rebate. They didn't say that was true. In fact, they said that they couldn't say because those are privileged conversations, but I felt that astute political observers could probably put 2 and 2 together and figure out that, you know, the Liberals are sad that the NEP's been getting credit for a good thing, and so they came up with a term to try and get more credit, as is the want of many folks around this place.